or so here. Good day, everyone, and welcome to the Price of Cloud Analytics presented by Perkins Consulting. We're going to go ahead and get started here. Just a quick outline. We're going to talk for about a half an hour here, provide an introduction to Perkins Consulting and the topic of cloud analytics, and then talk about how they differ from sort of traditional business intelligence and analytics tools. Talk about some specific criteria for a cloud analytics project that might make it a good prospect. And then wrap up with sort of a conclusion, talk a little bit about an assessment offer that Perkins Consulting is providing, and have a little bit of time for some Q&A at the end. If you can go ahead for your questions, everybody's muted at the moment. If you can just put your questions into the webinar tool there, there's a place for you to type questions, and then we'll hit all those at the end. Thanks. We'll go ahead and get started. A bit of introduction. Perkins Consulting has been around since 1994. Our expertise is really in analytics and information management. We've been focused on that for over 20 years now. My name is Bill Henderson. That's a picture of me there on the right. Our focus is really around making information powerful. So it's more than just technology. We make information powerful by ensuring that information is aligned throughout the organization. Everybody's seeing the same information from the same perspective and with the same context. That the data has good quality. The information is something that people can use to make decisions. That all of the members of the organization have the same vocabulary to talk about that business information. Revenue means revenue to everybody, right? So that they can have effective communications about information. And the processes that kind of go around this, you know, business intelligence is still a relatively new thing for a lot of organizations, and sometimes the processes and procedures haven't really solidified as far as they need to make it effective. So again, you know, our focus really data quality and sort of an enterprise-wide view of information enablement, how to really let organizations make information powerful for themselves. By way of introduction, we wanted to talk a little bit about, you know, what do we mean by that term cloud analytics and why do we care? I threw a couple of logos down at the bottom of a few of the products that I would consider cloud analytics products. Right? QuickSight from Amazon, Power BI, Looker, there are more. These tools don't look all that different in their user interface from more traditional business intelligence tools, things like Cognos from IBM or Business Objects from SAP. So they really don't look to the end user very different. And they are both the cloud, these new products, and the more traditional ones are used widely in an organization. So I'm not going to talk about list tools that are only maybe used by one or two people. This is not going to be a discussion about Hadoop or something like that. Cloud analytics are built on a public cloud, which is almost always Amazon Web Services, Google, or Microsoft Azure, since these three vendors have over 50% market share on the public cloud. And they represent, from a technology point of view, what we think of as the fourth generation in business intelligence applications. I thought we'd do a little comparison back and forth, you know, what traditional tools to the fourth generation, the cloud analytics tools. Traditionally, the current state of the art for things, again, like SAP Business Objects, IBM Cognos, is they're web-based, but they're based on premises. They're running on a server on an organization's internal network. The cloud analytics, this fourth generation, they're hosted in a public cloud. AWS, Google, Microsoft Azure. The older ones have relatively fixed scalability. If you want to add a bunch more users, you install more servers, right? And you provide your own storage for your data. The cloud analytics ones are they truly scale across a public cloud. So there's tremendous potential scalability and almost always some kind of backing storage. So Amazon QuickSight uses something they call Spice. The Power BI offering from Microsoft uses some of their columnar store, parallel data warehouse capabilities. But there's some storage potential there. Traditionally, business intelligence applications are sold in role-based licensing, perpetual licensing, and then you're paying roughly 20% a year in support per license. The new cloud analytics are a subscription basis with no license, although there's plenty of legalese. There's still a user agreement. Traditional applications tend to get updated once, twice, 3 or 4 times a year. Whereas these cloud analytics things are much more like a smartphone app. They're updated daily, weekly, monthly, more often. Traditionally, any data integration that needs to happen in a business analytics tool is managed by an IT group. It's done sort of centrally, and that's kind of the architecture that these traditional tools are based around, although they've been adding more capabilities to let users integrate data recently. But the cloud analytics tools, by and large, let the end users do their own data integration, and that obviously has both pros and cons. If there's any kind of agreement as to uptime, performance, availability, any sort of service level agreement around that, with a traditional tool, it's done internally. It's your IT organization that's offering that service level agreement. With the cloud analytics tools, they all provide an SLA. They guarantee a certain level of availability and performance. So that's a little bit of the pros, the comparison of the two. Well, let's talk about some specific attributes now of how they differ. A big one is speed. Because there's no hardware to deploy, no licenses to buy, potentially cloud analytics can provide a higher speed of response to business changes. The big question is your organization in a place that they can accommodate that? Many organizations are on annual budgeting and planning cycles. So being able to, even if you can technically spin up some cloud analytics very quickly, is it going to work with your organization? It changes the way of thinking about analytics. It becomes more of a tactical thing, or can be. You can think about spinning up a cloud analytics environment simply to answer a specific business question or a tactical business issue. It doesn't have to be a long-term infrastructure play. And we've actually seen surprisingly higher performance due to these backing data stores that we talked about for the cloud analytics tools, where we can take a set of data, put it up into one of these tools, and suddenly see operations on that data, visualizations and manipulations happen a lot faster. So in theory, we can support larger amounts of data and larger numbers of users. So kind of closely related to speed, I think, is agility. In our experience with cloud analytics tools, we're typically delivering first deliverables within hours or days, whereas in our work with the third generation tools, a lot of times there was waiting on hardware specification, hardware acquisition, hardware provision, or virtual machine provisioning. So a lot of times it was a 4 to 8 week process. In our opinion, this speed, this ability to be agile, this ability to get something up quickly, show it to the end users, and see if it's correct or incorrect, if it's valuable to the business or not valuable to the business, is worth the pain that comes from being able to do things quickly, right? If we can do things quickly with cloud analytics, that raises the user's expectations as well, and there's a certain amount of pain that goes with that. It also means we have less time to prep for the alignment and communication. We have less time to spend while we're waiting on hardware and licenses in ensuring that the organization has a common view of information, that we're all agreeing on our terminology, that we're all agreed on our business vocabulary, that we all know how we're going to get together and communicate about information. And therefore, it requires more use of tools to help ensure data quality, ensure that we're all on the same page, that we have common metadata and common vocabulary. I think it's interesting to talk a little bit about the timing of acquisition costs. So two charts here on the left, the top one showing kind of for a traditional environment, BI application environment for 100 users, kind of separating it into hardware, software, and support, and showing it over a 5-year period, right? So after that initial investment in hardware, and software, really it's just the support cost that continues to grow over time. Whereas with the cloud, pretty much all the cost is just that subscription cost, and it continues to increase over time. So this is kind of based on, our background, many years of working in this space. We usually estimate that on a traditional basis, you're typically looking about $500 a user for the license and another $100 per each license in annual support. And the hardware typically breaks down to around $100 per user in initial acquisition cost. Right now, the cloud model is looking at about $120 per user per year, and they're all in about that same price range. I think all the vendors are watching each other very carefully. And obviously, there's no hardware. So what about your return on investment? These two diagrams to the left show the cost side. They don't really show the return side. It's easy to say that because we can get started more quickly with a cloud analytics project, we should get a faster return on investment. In our experience, it's not so much a faster return on investment as it's a faster go or no-go decision with the project. Because in both of these two cases, we wind up often waiting for the data. In other words, the data has not been well put together, has not been sourced, has not been vetted. There's been no quality, so we wind up waiting for that. But the cloud does let us do sort of a proof of concept or POC deployment until that data is ready. We can get something out in front of our end users pretty quickly and vet that. So another wrinkle that we're seeing with cloud analytics is that because the investment tends to be more business initiative and project driven, it doesn't fit very well into a lot of organizations' methodology for planning things, annual budgets and things like that. Cloud analytics also have a really important distinction in that you can turn off users and turn them back on, and you don't have to pay back support. So most of the large traditional BI application vendors, if you purchase 500 users and then at some point drop the support down to maybe 100 users, and then a year later decide you want to add 100 users back on support, you have to pay the back support on that, right? Which can be a significant cost. The cloud analytics, it doesn't really matter. Turn it on, turn it off, turn it on, turn it off. It's typically at the month grain. And this is kind of a tricky one. In theory, because you haven't committed to a bunch of hardware and licenses from a large enterprise BI application vendor, you have more flexibility, right? Your sunk cost isn't there. But we would also argue that it can potentially open the door to too many tools. It's easy to wind up with a situation where you have 5 or 6 different tools, and for someone to be effective on a project, they need to know at least half of those. So the training can get really heavy. A lot of the cloud analytics tools have an open source basis to some extent, and so we may start to see over the next 5 years or so some synergies there that maybe will help reduce the need for training. Wanted to give a brief example. So a few years back, a fellow named Leland Wilkinson wrote a book called Grammar of Graphics. The ideas behind that book wound up in a commercial traditional BI tool called Tableau. But they also wound up in an open source JavaScript library called D3. And that library, in turn, is the library that's used for the visualizations in Microsoft's Power BI Cloud Analytics tool. And it's also used in Hadley Wickham's ggplot package for R. So you can kind of see that perhaps in the future we're going to see more synergies like that, where if there's sort of a standardization around understanding concepts like the grammar of graphics, that will help users leverage multiple tools because you'll start to see some consistency. That's really only a hope at this point, I think. The big question is, if we're doing all this project-driven cloud analytics work, where does the investment in a data warehouse and sort of that centralized data view, data quality, where does that get funded? Where is enabling and training the users on business vocabulary and metadata, where is that funded? So in the previous diagrams, we looked a little bit about how costs for 100 users might vary over time. I wanted to also look at it a little differently. What about if we're adding users over time, right? So in a traditional model, hardware is a stepped sort of cost structure. In other words, we start off with maybe one server. And then after we get a few more users added, things start to slow down and we add another server and we scale out, right? Or we scale up, we go to a larger server. So it looks like a stepped line. In the cloud, there's no hardware investment, right? And it should scale indefinitely. I'll put that indefinitely in quotes. The software cost, again, average probably $500 a user, and you're paying that once. The cloud, you're averaging $10 per user, and you're paying it every single month, right? So $120 a year. Support cost in the traditional model would be about $100 per user per year, and in the cloud it would be zero, right? Because it's all wrapped into the subscription. The enablement, what does it take to pull the data together, ensure good data quality, get people on a common business vocabulary and all that? In our experience, that is very steep at the beginning. There's a lot of effort that has to go into that in the beginning of an initiative. Get agreement on things like what does revenue mean? What does sales mean? But then it tends to flatten out, and as you add users, you don't really typically have to invest a whole lot more in that area. And that's the same for both traditional and cloud. You can't avoid those issues. So these have very different sort of price models and price models that vary by user and over time, but they both have this common issue of you've got to figure out how to enable users to make use of the information in a business environment. Got to have the vocabulary, got to have the context, got to be able to find what you're after quickly. I don't often get a chance to use a picture of Karl Marx in a presentation, but here he is. So Karl said that the ownership of capital perpetuates inequality. The people who own the heavy factories and the heavy equipment, you know, they're always going to be rich and everyone else is always going to be poor. I bring that up because it's pretty obvious already that cloud services, public cloud services, are going to become an oligopoly, right? There's only going to be a few very large players. Like I said, right now, the top 3 players have over 50% market share, and they're accelerating. So what does that mean? It means if you want to start your own cloud, public cloud service, that's probably not a great idea. It also means that if you're using cloud analytics, the startup capital needed to do something super sophisticated is low and getting lower all the time. And I think that's important because your competitors can also take advantage of this, right? They could be doing some very sophisticated thing in cloud analytics with a much lower cost to get started than somebody who's on a more traditional analytics platform. Another little quirk of that word capital is that traditional BI applications are often capitalized projects, right? We get to write off the depreciation on them. Cloud analytics is going to have to be expensed. And how does that impact, again, budgeting and planning processes? Are people going to be resistant to this just simply because they can't capitalize it? Another important factor, I think, is this idea that cloud analytics get updated a lot. They're also interesting, often highly user-driven. In other words, all of the vendors that I'm aware of have some sort of forum for users to put out requests for improvement and new ideas, and they tend to actually be pretty responsive to that. Whereas the traditional analytics are updated much less frequently, and a lot of times their releases are driven by a very strong internal product management role that is responding much more to what the competitors are doing than to what necessarily users are asking for. In our experience, it's actually been easier to absorb changes at that smartphone type update rhythm, right? Daily, weekly, monthly. It's actually easier to deal with that than it is to deal with the once a quarter or twice a year sort of major, oh my gosh, here comes a new release and everything's changing. We'd also seen it that organizations who've really embraced lean and lean methodologies have an easier time with this sort of rapid update rhythm. But what about breaking changes? What about if the cloud analytics vendor comes out with a new weekly update and it breaks a bunch of your reports and dashboards and analytics? And we have seen this already happening. Although another observation might be that we've seen cloud analytics seem to have fewer bugs than some of the traditional apps. Anyway, you can't have breaking changes, and therefore automated testing, getting to the point where you're running automated test suites against these web-based interfaces is going to be important, right? Because you want to take that new release, run the test suites against it quickly and know where you stand and deal with those issues very quickly. So let's talk about risk a little bit. I mean, there's a lot of angles of risk. One interesting thing is that cloud analytics can provide some geo-replication. In other words, if you're putting your data and your analytics up in this public cloud, it's very simple to have that geo-replicated across the country or across the world. So from a business continuity and disaster recovery perspective, that could be pretty powerful. On the other hand, if you are actually pushing data up to the public cloud, you may need to watch out for, European privacy regulations and things like that around where that data is stored. This was an interesting quote from Gartner, the analyst group. And the point I would make about this is that, I think they're saying this is going to apply whether you're doing traditional analytics or cloud analytics, right? Either way, the key thing is not the technology as much as it is, do you have kind of the business processes around that technology, and are you is that technology being used to make really great business decisions and business improvement? Is it being governed properly? In our experience, both cloud and traditional analytics projects, when they fail, they don't fail spectacularly. They tend to be running failures. In other words, they're up and they're running and they're delivering dashboards and reports and analytics. But because the enablement process was never undertaken, nobody's actually using that, or it's being used very lightly, or it's being used to just confirm what everybody already knew, right? And those we would consider to be running failures. And again, that can happen with both traditional or cloud analytics. Okay, so kind of wrapping this up a little bit, what are some criteria for a cloud analytics project, things that might make it particularly well suited? One would be if you need to get it done quick, you need to get it up, you need to show some results very quickly. Another would be maybe your data is really poorly structured and you need that back-end data store to help compensate for that poor structure because you don't have time to go solve the structural issues. If you have a limited budget, getting 10 people up on a cloud analytics tool at $10 per person per month, there's not a lot to that. An interesting twist on this is, do you need to be able to access it over the internet. You know, sometimes if traditional BI applications are set up on an internal network, exposing that to the internet is a big deal and requires a lot of thinking and process. Cloud analytics does not necessarily require that, and that's a topic we could do a whole presentation about, is authentication and authorization and access to information and privacy. And anyway, a whole interesting topic for cloud analytics. If you've already got data and you know the quality is already there and you know the context is kind of baked into it, you know, Perkins Consulting, we have a couple of tools that we use. Alex for sort of metadata and context and showing people if their information is complete and up to date, and Rubric for capturing high quality data at the source. And if you've got those types of capabilities already in place, then you're probably well situated to dive into a cloud analytics project sooner rather than later. Okay, just a few conclusion thoughts here. One is there's no way to put this genie back in the bottle. So I think all of us who work in this space have to recognize cloud analytics are here, and we have to be aware of their pros and cons, and we have to accept those and deal with those. They're not going to go away. A question I ask business people a lot is, how do you feel about owning servers and software licenses? Does that fact right there, does that get you excited? Does that help promote and move your business forward? And most of them say no. If we didn't have to own servers, we'd be perfectly happy. So that's a strong argument that cloud analytics will continue to grow. You know, I've brought this up a couple of times, but can your internal processes, how you plan for things, budget for things, execute initiatives and projects, can it keep up with this technology, with this cloud analytics approach? As part of all this, Perkins Consulting, we're doing a free assessment. We conducted over a web meeting with a checklist that we've built that just helps identify in more detail than this presentation where your organization might or might not be a good fit for cloud analytics. So with that, I'd like to open it up for any type of Q&A. Here's the contact information for me, information about how to get the assessment, a little bit of background on Lean, if you're not familiar with that term, and a little bit of background on the grammar of graphics. With that, I will see if there are any questions to answer. I certainly thank you all for your time, and I realize we're right at 10:30 here. I'll give it just a minute for questions. I don't see any yet. Okay, well, I thank you all for your time, and would certainly love to hear back from you, any follow-up or ideas for improvement on the presentation, and I hope that we'll get a chance to talk about an assessment of your organization. Thank you very much for your time, and have a good day.